The US and Canada, two neighbors who share the world's longest peaceful border, yet their history reads more like a rivalry than a friendship. From invasions and border wars to tariff battles and political jabs, these allies have clashed more times than most enemies. And now, with rising economic tension and bold talk about Canada becoming America's 51st state, that old rivalry might be heading toward its most shocking twist yet. So let's jump into 10 moments when these two neighbors went head-to-head. 10. The invasion of Quebec, 1775, the first cross-border gamble. Let's start where it all began, with an invasion that almost changed North America forever. In 1775, at the height of the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Army attempted to invade British-controlled Quebec. Generals Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold led two separate forces north, hoping to cut Britain's supply line and convince French-Canadian residents to join the rebellion. It was one of the first times organized US troops crossed into what would later become Canadian territory. The campaign ended in heavy losses. Montgomery was killed during the assault on Quebec City, Arnold was wounded, and hundreds of American troops were captured. Local populations, wary of both sides, largely stayed neutral or loyal to Britain. That single defeat killed the dream of annexing Canada before it ever began. It taught both sides a lesson that would echo for centuries. The border may look like a line on a map, but crossing it has always come at a cost. 9. The War of 1812, the border that wouldn't break. By 1812, tension between the United States and Britain had reached breaking point. Trade blockades, naval seizures, and forced conscription of American sailors pushed both nations to conflict. Because Canada was still a British colony, the northern border quickly became the front line. The US launched several invasions into Upper and Lower Canada, hoping to pressure Britain by cutting off its foothold in North America. The results were mixed and costly. American troops advanced across the Great Lakes and along the Niagara frontier, but British regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous allies defended key positions. Battles like Queenston Heights, Chrysler's Farm, and Chateauguay ended with heavy casualties on both sides. In 1814, British and Canadian forces countered, crossing into US territory and burning parts of Washington, D.C. in retaliation for earlier American attacks. When the Treaty of Ghent ended the war, neither side gained land, but both gained identity. 8. The Caroline Affair, 1837 to 1842. The fire that nearly started a war. This one started with a single ship and nearly ended with a war. In 1837, rebellion was spreading through Upper Canada, and American sympathizers began ferrying men and weapons across the Niagara River on a small steamboat called the Caroline. One winter night, British Loyalist forces crossed into US territory, seized the vessel, set it ablaze, and sent it over Niagara Falls. An American crewman was killed. The reaction was explosive. US newspapers demanded retaliation, militias mobilized, and Britain defended the attack as self-defense against rebels using American soil. For 5 tense years, the two sides traded threats and diplomatic notes, each refusing to admit fault. The crisis finally cooled in 1842 with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which quietly settled the dispute. The Caroline Affair showed just how fragile the US-Canada border once was. One ship, one spark, and both nations were suddenly staring down the edge of another war. 7. The Aroostook War, 1838 to 1839. The war with no battles. Imagine two countries preparing for war over trees. That's exactly what happened in the late 1830s when the border between Maine and New Brunswick was still unclear, and both sides claimed the same forest rich in timber. What began as lumber crews marking territory quickly escalated into armed patrols, making arrests and militias mobilizing for combat. For months, American and British forces faced off in the frozen woods, convinced war was coming, yet no official battle ever took place. Diplomacy finally stepped in, and the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 redrew the line and ended the standoff peacefully. The Aroostook War proved how fragile the early US-Canada border really was. One wrong tree or river was enough to start a war. 6. The Oregon Boundary Dispute, 1846. The line that nearly sparked a war. In the 1840s, both the United States and Britain claimed the Oregon Territory, a massive region stretching from California to Alaska. American settlers poured in, demanding the border be pushed north to latitude 54°40, rallying behind the slogan, 5440 or fight. Britain's Hudson's Bay Company already operated trading posts across the area, and neither side was willing to retreat. For years, tension built as both nations expanded west, each warning the other not to cross the line. War seemed possible until 1846 when diplomats struck a compromise. The border was fixed at the 49th parallel, giving the US modern-day Oregon and Washington, while Britain kept what became British Columbia. On number 5. The Fenian Raids, 1866-1871, when Irish rebels crossed the border. After the US Civil War, Irish-American veterans known as the Fenians turned their attention to British-controlled Canada. Their goal wasn't conquest, it was strategy. They believed that by seizing Canadian territory, they could pressure Britain into granting Ireland's independence. Between 1866 and 1871, Fenian forces launched several small invasions from US soil, crossing into Canada at Ridgeway, Pigeon Hill, and Eccles Hill. Canadian militia and British troops quickly repelled them, and American officials, alarmed by the cross-border violence, arrested the Fenian leaders and ended the campaign. The raids failed, but their consequences were lasting. They exposed how vulnerable the colonies were and accelerated the push for Canadian Confederation in 1867, turning an attempted invasion into a catalyst for unification. Number 4. The Alaska Boundary Dispute, 1898 to 1903. The border redrawn. After the US purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, the border with Canada was poorly defined and largely ignored, until gold was discovered in the Klondike in 1896. The rush north made every mountain pass and coastal inlet suddenly valuable, and both nations claimed the same territory along the Alaska Panhandle. Disputes over who controlled access to the goldfields escalated quickly. American and Canadian patrols shadowed miners, each side insisting the other had crossed into its land. The crisis was finally sent to arbitration in 1903, where the decision favored the United States. Canada lost most of its claim, and resentment grew when Britain, representing Canada diplomatically at the time, backed the US to avoid conflict. The Trade and Tariff Wars, 1930s. When economics became a battlefield. In the 1930s, the Great Depression shattered economies worldwide, and trade between the United States and Canada collapsed under a wave of protectionism. The US passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, raising import taxes on more than 20,000 goods. Canada, heavily reliant on US markets, hit back with its own retaliatory tariffs. Cross-border trade fell by nearly 2/3, crippling industries and driving unemployment higher on both sides. What began as an attempt to protect domestic jobs turned into a self-inflicted wound, showing how quickly allies can damage each other when economics turns political. It took years of diplomacy and the shared demands of World War II to rebuild trust and reopen markets. Number 2. The modern trade and energy clashes, 1980s-2020s. The Economic Cold War. From the 1980s onward, US-Canada relations entered a cycle of trade and energy disputes. The softwood lumber dispute became a recurring battle. The US accused Canada of unfair subsidies, while Canada denied it. Tariffs, appeals, and countermeasures dragged on for decades, costing billions in lost exports. Energy soon became the next fault line. The 2018 US tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under national security rules triggered immediate retaliation, and the Keystone XL pipeline cancellation in 2021 reignited tensions, pitting environmental policy against energy trade. Even under NAFTA and later the USMCA, the disputes never disappeared, they just evolved. 1. Modern political and security tensions, 2001 on present. The border that never sleeps. After 2001, the US-Canada relationship shifted towards security and surveillance. The September 11th attacks turned the world's longest open border into a heavily monitored one, reshaping trade, travel, and immigration. Both nations expanded NORAD operations and intelligence sharing, balancing security with economic flow. New points of friction soon followed: defense spending, migration policy, and Arctic sovereignty. Washington continues to press Ottawa to meet NATO's 2% defense target, while Canada's limited military budget fuels debate about reliance on US protection. Disagreements over China and energy policy add to the strain, even as cooperation on defense and trade remains vital. Part 2. What are the actual odds that Canada becomes a US state? Despite centuries of border disputes, invasions, and trade wars, Canada and the United States have never been more connected. What began with muskets and fort lines evolved into pipelines, trade routes, and joint defense systems. The border, once guarded by armies, is now crossed by millions of trucks and travelers each year. History built a wall of sovereignty between them, yet geography, defense, and economics have bound the two countries so tightly that, in many ways, they already function like parts of the same system. Still, the legal, political, and cultural barriers remain immense, and those are the real factors that determine how close Canada could ever come to becoming a US state. The legal path exists, but it's steep under the US Constitution. Article 4, Section 3, Congress can admit new states with consent. In theory, Canada could join through a bilateral treaty followed by constitutional amendments on both sides. But Canada's 750 rule, approval by Parliament and 7 provinces representing at least half the population, makes that almost impossible politically. The precedent often cited is Texas, 1845, which joined voluntarily as a former independent nation. Legally possible? Yes. Politically realistic? Not without a national consensus Canada doesn't have. Economic integration is already deep. Trade between the two nations surpassed $950 billion USD in 2024, making Canada the US's largest trading partner. Energy, autos, agriculture, and manufacturing flow across the border daily. Over 75% of Canadian exports go to the US, while many American industries depend on Canadian raw materials. Shared supply chains, currencies traded in USD, and synchronized market cycles already make the two economies semi-fused. In many practical ways, Canada operates like a de facto US economic region, just without the shared government. Defense ties blur sovereignty. Through NORAD, Canada and the US share a continental air defense network that tracks every aircraft approaching North America. The US funds most of its infrastructure and satellite systems, while Canadian forces operate jointly within American command centers. With rising Arctic competition from Russia and China, the US increasingly views Canada's northern territory as a strategic zone too important to be underfunded. If NATO weakens, deeper military integration could push Canada closer to US command structures, a quiet step toward political dependency. Political pressures could shift the equation. Regional divides inside Canada keep the idea alive. Western provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan often clash with Ottawa over energy policy, equalization payments, and federal control. Movements like Wexit or the Alberta Prosperity Project frame closer alignment with the US as an economic lifeline. In a future crisis, a deep recession or federal-provincial breakdown, those regions could seek a stronger US partnership or even partial affiliation before full statehood is ever considered. Public opinion shows generational splits. Surveys reveal growing curiosity, not commitment. An Ipsos 2024 poll found 43% of Canadians aged 18 to 34 would accept US citizenship if given equal financial benefits. In the US, about half of Republican voters say they'd support Canada joining if it requested. Older Canadians and Quebec remain firmly opposed, viewing statehood as erasure of identity. Younger generations, however, see continental integration as increasingly normal, from streaming culture to job markets. So, after centuries of rivalry and alliance, Canada and the US are more connected than ever in trade, defense, and destiny. The border still stands, but for how long? Will Canada always be America's neighbor, or someday its next state?